On February 9th, 1964, 73 million people tuned in to watch a live broadcast. It was not the Super Bowl. It was not another sporting event. Instead, it was just four men singing on a stage. Welcome to Music Education with Mr. Johnson, and today we're going to talk about that event just briefly, but we're going to look at the transformative movement that this event spawned. So on that February 9th night, if you don't know anything else about Ed Sullivan, but you know the name Ed Sullivan, you know this one thing, that the Beatles sang in America for the first time on the Ed Sullivan Show. They sang 5 songs that night, and that night would be known as the symbolic beginning of the British invasion. So what is the British invasion? It was a period of time from 1964 to 1966, specifically those years when bands from the UK came over to the United States and dominated the radio airwaves for those years. There are 4 big bands that we think of at this time. The first one is the Beatles, the second one is the Rolling Stones, the third one is the Who, and the fourth one is the Kinks. So let's talk about these bands just briefly. The first one, the Beatles, you probably have heard of them. As a matter of fact, they probably did more to shape rock and roll than anybody else except for maybe Elvis. And even with Elvis, he was the beginner, but the Beatles took it to a whole new level. As a matter of fact, in the 60s, I believe Elvis had 6 number 1 hits. I may be wrong on that, but I believe it was 6. But in the 1960s, the Beatles had 18 number 1 hits, and they spent 55 weeks at the number 1 spot. So who were the Beatles? They were John, Paul, George, and Ringo. By the way, little known fact, one of my nicknames in high school was Ringo. True story. We'll talk about that some other time. But these men, they came over, they dominated the airwaves. They started what was known as Beatlemania. As a matter of fact, it really set up a new way that concerts were experienced, not only here in the United States, but all over the world. As a matter of fact, some people would go to concerts and never actually hear them sing because young women would stand as close as they could to the stage and literally just scream through the whole concert. This is why it's called Beatlemania. They created this kind of idea that a singer-songwriter or singer-songwriters could produce hits. It was a whole new way of pop music being made. They influenced rock and roll in such a way that now, even today, 70 plus years or 60 to 70 years later, people are still talking about the influence that the Beatles have on their music today. A couple of songs that they start off with were I Want to Hold Your Hand and She Loves You. There's later on, I've got a few of their records here. This is a 45. This is one of their last records. It's Revolution. And on the other side is Hey Jude. Hey Jude became one of their most popular songs that they ever did. The Beatles laid the foundation for what it looks like for rock and roll groups to come along behind them later. The second group that we talked about are the Rolling Stones. Now, the Rolling Stones were a little bit different than the Beatles because the Rolling Stones were known more as a rebellious group. They were known as the bad boys of the British invasion, or at least the early part of the British invasion. They showed up in 1964 as well. They're led by 2 people. They're still playing today, by the way, and that is Mick Jagger's and Keith Richards. Again, they had this bad boy image or reputation. There are 2 songs that they kind of were known for to start off with. They made hits all the way up through the 80s. And then, like I said, they're still singing today. But 2 big hits early on were Paint It Black and Satisfaction. Here's an interesting kind of fact to know about Satisfaction. The first ever fuzz pedal, if you know anything about pedals for guitars, the first ever fuzz pedal was used on the song Satisfaction. Keith Richards used it really to kind of fill in while they're in the studio, to kind of have this odd sound that just to kind of fill in so that they would know they were going to come back later and put some horns in. But the guy who was producing their record, he went ahead and put it out with that fuzz on it. As a matter of fact, when it hit the airwaves, the Rolling Stones, that's really when they heard it for the first time and they thought, man, our career is ruined. And that song ended up making not only tons of money, spending a lot of time on the airwaves, but that fuzz pedal the fuzz pedal is probably one of the most used pedals now for guitars, even today in 2025. So that's the Rolling Stones. They helped popularize kind of blues rock, if you will. Their big influence, by the way, was American blues artists, especially from Chicago. But they also covered some other bands, some other blues bands, some of their songs from more the deep South as well. The third band that I want to talk about is The Who, and The Who was very interesting. They were, in a lot of ways, the heaviest of these these four bands. They really had this kind of sound that was really characteristic of power chords. Now, if you're not a music person and you don't know what power chords are, that's okay. But what a power chord is, it's really just two notes that are played in a chord instead of 3 or 5 notes or whatever. And so these power chords, they would use those to kind of create a very specific sound, and it becomes a very full sound. They had two kind of interesting hits. One of them is My Generation, and it's a great song that is kind of a rebellious song against the older generation, and they're saying, look at our generation, it's a little bit different. What's interesting in this song is as they're singing, the lead singer, as he's singing, he actually kind of stutters. He didn't mean to do that on purpose, but he ended up leaving it in, and it becomes a signature feature of this song. The Who is also known for something fascinating. They created what's called a rock opera. So if you've ever heard of an opera, it's a performance that is done completely by singing. Well, they created this rock opera, and it's called Tommy. They had a song in it called The Pinball Wizard. It's this whole story about this guy who cannot see, he cannot hear, and he cannot talk, but he becomes an amazing pinball wizard. What's interesting is when you listen to the whole rock opera, as a matter of fact, it was produced and made into, basically a movie. They put it out, and Tommy in the movie becomes this big superstar who kind of then loses his way and kind of creates this cult, really, in the whole thing. The Who really become pioneers, or not really pioneers, but they kind of paved the way for punk rock and some other harder rock. And the last band of those four big ones that we talked about are the Kinks. And the Kinks are ones that you may not know. You may not know them as well. You may not have heard of them if being a younger person. But one of their most famous songs was called You've Really Got Me. You Really Got Me Now. As a matter of fact, I have it right here on a 45 as well. You Really Got Me Now, or You Really Got Me. And this has 4 songs on it. You Really Got Me, It's All Right, All Day and All of the Night. That's a song you probably know as well. And I Gotta Move. The Kinks, as they sang, they had this really interesting kind of way of playing guitar. It's not like super heavy, but at the same time, it very much influenced punk rockers as well later on, and even kind of heavier music, just like the Who, but kind of in a different way. So when we talk about the British invasion, what we need to think about is how did it impact the American music culture, and actually how did it impact culture in America as well? Well, first off, the musical style and innovation. What's interesting is every one of these British bands, especially the 4 that we talked about. By the way, let me mention a few other bands. You have the Animals. You have the Dave Clark 5. Here's the Dave Clark 5 right here. Here's one of their 45s. Herman Hermits, some other bands like that. They come in. Every single one of these bands, one of the things that they would talk about was, what are your influences? They would always ask this when they came through. And all of them would talk about either the blues, and that would be specifically the Rolling Stones, specifically the Who and some of the others. But they would talk about R&B, being influenced by R&B here in the United States, talking about being influenced by early rock and roll. And what they did is they took that style of music, all these different styles of music, they kind of formed them, they made them their own, and they produced something that was really, in a lot of ways, completely different. So they took this older music and made it their own style and produced something that was pretty awesome. So we see a big influence on the musical style and innovation that they brought to the United States. Also, the songwriting and production. 2 big things to think about, like with the Beatles. You have these singer-songwriters, and when I say that, you had John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison all writing these amazing songs. And then Ringo Starr wrote some songs too. They're not usually considered amazing songs, but these guys were writing their own music. They came together, put the music together themselves, came up with their own arrangements and ideas, and then put it out, which is a little bit different than what especially some of the earlier rock and roll people were doing, which were taking other songs that people had written and putting them out, not so much writing their own. It also had a huge impact, the British invasion, on youth culture and especially like fashion. When you look at the Beatles, they had these, they called them mop tops, their haircuts. And that became a famous style to wear. And then the Rolling Stones, they ended up growing their hair out even longer, and it became kind of this rebellious attitude. There's also this style of dress that people kind of adopted during that time. And what's interesting is when we look at these different influences on the culture, what ended up happening was then people in the United States were influenced by the Beatles, and like I said, still are today. They then took the idea that the Beatles had done, which grew off of what Elvis and what blues writers had done, like Muddy Waters. By the way, the Rolling Stones got their name from a song that Muddy Waters wrote called The Rolling Stone or Rolling Stone. And they took this music and then they formed it again into their own way. People like Bob Dylan and the Beach Boys specifically talked about the influence that the Beatles had on them. So we have this British invasion. It comes in specifically 1964 to 1966. Now we'll talk about this later, but just for your notes, know this. The band that is credited with bringing music back to the United States, back to recording in California, is a band known as Creedence Clearwater Revival. That's one we'll talk about later, one you very much need to know. But today, this is kind of our quick lesson on the British invasion. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the Who, and the Kinks had an incredible impact on American culture, and it all began February 9th, 1964. Now listen, you know that every time I do these kind of lessons, one of the things I want to do is bring it back, talk about some kind of social emotional learning, things that we can kind of learn from this. I think there's a few things that we can learn. Number one, when we look at these bands and kind of how they came in and produced this music that really kind of changed the world in a lot of ways, musically changed the world. They had influences and roots back in music that went even further back before them, long before them. And I think there's this kind of saying. Now follow me here. This may sound kind of weird to you, but just follow me for a minute. There's a play, actually it's a musical, and it's called Fiddler on the Roof. And in the musical, there's this guy and he's singing, and this whole musical, they're dealing with change in their family, they're dealing with change in their culture, they're dealing with all this different type of change. But there's a song, and in the song they sing about their traditions. And at one point, the guy who's leading out, his name's Tevye, he says, "Without our traditions, our lives would be as shaky as a fiddler on the roof." Now, just follow me for a minute. Just hear me out. These guys who made this song and wrote this music, they were reaching way back to traditions before them, way back to traditions that preceded them, some of them before they were even born. But they drew inspiration from that, and they learned from that, and they applied it to their music, or they took it and applied their own kind of style to that music and made it something different and something new. And a lot of times in our lives, we have to realize what our influences are. And we don't want to deny our roots. We don't want to deny who we are. We don't want to deny who we are as a family, or, in our families, who we grew up to be. But at the same time, there are some things that we may want to embrace and move forward with and be creative with it. So my encouragement to you today is know the things that you need to hold on tightly to. What are the things in your life that are important? It's your family, I hope. Or it may be some friends that are very special to you. It may be some ideas that you've grown up with. and you enjoy. But there are some things that we can embrace that are new and be creative with our lives and create something new that impacts the world in a really kind of special way. There's one other thing I want to share. There's a song that the Beatles did, and I'll be honest with you, sometimes some of you may know a little bit about me. I'll share maybe more as we go along, but there's a song that really has been special in my life, and that song is Here Comes the Sun. And in it, George Harrison writes it. It was actually in a tumultuous time with the Beatles, and essentially he wrote this song, and he says, look, y'all, this is, in the song, it's basically like, this is where it's been. It's been gray, it's been hazy, it's been foggy, and sometimes we're in that place in our life. But he says, here comes the sun. It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. Today, my encouragement to you is this. If you're in that place where it is dark and it's cloudy in your life, look forward to a brighter day. Let me bring in some scripture for you real quick. The psalmist says that tears last for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Listen, I've gone longer than I usually do, so I'm going to wrap up here, and let me say this. As I say every week, love your neighbor, take care of yourself, be the good the world needs. See you soon.